"Grandpa, you're holding it wrong." The tactical instructor couldn't hide his smirk as he watched the old man fumble with the weapon. 20 years of training civilians, and he'd never seen someone look more out of place at a gun range. The elderly man, who'd introduced himself simply as Frank, adjusted his grip on the Glock 19 with visibly trembling hands. His weathered fingers, marked by age spots and prominent veins, seemed to struggle with the weight of the pistol. At 84 years old, Frank Morrison stood barely 5 feet 8 in his worn New Balance sneakers, faded khaki pants, and a Marine's cap that had seen better days. "Here, let me show you. Again," said Jake Thompson, the range's lead instructor. At 28, Jake was all modern tactical gear and confident swagger. His Instagram handle, @TacticalJake, was embroidered on his custom shooting vest, right below his numerous civilian training certifications. He reached over and roughly adjusted Frank's stance, not bothering to hide his frustration. "You need to lean forward, not back. And for God's sake, stop closing your left eye. This isn't a John Wayne movie." Around them, the other shooters at Thunder Ridge Tactical Range had begun to take notice. The state-of-the-art facility attracted serious enthusiasts. Law enforcement officers, competitive shooters, and weekend warriors with thousands of dollars in custom gear. Frank, in his drugstore reading glasses and trembling hands, stood out like a lost tourist at a SWAT convention. "Maybe we should start you on something smaller," Jake suggested loudly, making sure the gathering crowd could hear his expertise. "We have a 22 that's perfect for beginners, much less recoil, easier to control." He winked at Sarah, the range's receptionist, who was watching from behind the bulletproof glass. She giggled, shaking her head at the old man's obvious incompetence. Frank nodded slowly, his pale blue eyes studying the weapon in his hands. "I appreciate the advice, son. It's been a while since I've handled one of these. Things have changed quite a bit." His voice was soft, almost apologetic, with a slight rasp that spoke of age and perhaps too many years of cigarettes. "I'll say they've changed," Jake laughed. "This isn't World War II anymore, Pops. Modern firearms require proper technique, not just point and shoot." He turned to address the small crowd that had gathered. "This is exactly why we have age restrictions on our advanced courses. No offense, sir, but at your age, the reflexes just aren't there anymore." A younger shooter in the next lane, wearing a Mullen-Labe t-shirt and tactical pants, chuckled. "Hey, Jake, maybe he thinks this is the senior center's air rifle range." The comment drew snickers from several observers. Frank's hands continued to shake as he raised the pistol again. The tremor was pronounced, making the barrel wave in small circles. He squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, completely missing the target at just 7 yards. The second shot wasn't much better, catching the edge of the paper. "Jesus Christ," Jake muttered, not quite under his breath. "Sir, I'm going to have to insist you put the weapon down. This is becoming a safety issue." He reached for the pistol, but Frank stepped back slightly. "Just give me a moment, please," Frank said quietly. "I need to adjust to these new sights. My eyes aren't what they used to be." "That's exactly my point," Jake said, his patience completely exhausted. "Look, no disrespect to your generation or whatever, but this is a serious range for serious shooters. We had a guy last month blow a hole in the ceiling because he couldn't control the recoil. I can't have another incident like that." The range owner, Mike Peterson, had now joined the growing audience. A former Army Ranger with 2 tours in Afghanistan, Mike prided himself on running the tightest, most professional range in 3 states. He watched Frank's shaking hands with a mixture of concern and annoyance. His insurance was already through the roof. "Jake's right," Mike said, stepping forward with authority. "Sir, I appreciate your interest, but we have liability issues to consider. At your age, with those tremors, you're a danger to yourself and others. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Frank lowered the pistol, safetied it, and placed it on the bench. He turned to face Mike, and for just a moment, something flickered in those pale blue eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. Ranger, huh? Frank said, noting the tab tattooed on Mike's forearm. 2nd Battalion? Mike blinked, surprised. 3rd, actually. How did you— The way you carry yourself, Frank said simply. Had a few Rangers under my command once. Good soldiers. Best light infantry in the world, when properly trained. Jake rolled his eyes. Great. Another stolen valor wannabe. Let me guess. You were some kind of super soldier back in Nam. Frank shook his head slightly. Korea, actually. And Vietnam. And a few places in between that officially didn't happen. He picked up the Glock again, and this time, something was different. The tremor in his hands had suddenly, mysteriously, stopped. Sir, I said put the weapon. Mike started, but Frank had already turned to the range, raised the pistol with rock-steady hands, and fired 5 shots in rapid succession. The sound was different somehow, controlled, rhythmic, almost musical. Every shot had gone through the same hole. Dead center. The range fell silent. Jake grabbed the spotting scope, certain there had to be some mistake. But there it was. A single, perfectly round hole in the X-ring, slightly larger than one bullet would make. 5 shots, 1 hole, at 7 yards with a pistol he'd been fumbling with moments before. How? Sarah gasped from behind the glass. Frank safetied the weapon and set it down. You were right about the sights, he said to Jake. They are different from what I'm used to. Much better, actually. He pulled the target back and examined it with satisfaction. Mike Peterson stepped closer. His entire demeanor changed. Something about the way Frank had handled that pistol, the specific thumb-forward grip, the modified Weaver stance that had gone out of style decades ago, but was still deadly effective, the way he'd controlled his breathing between shots. Who are you? He asked quietly. Frank reached into his wallet and pulled out an old faded card. It was a range qualification certificate from Marine Corps Base Quantico, dated 1963. The name read, Gunnery Sergeant Frank Morrison, Senior Marksmanship Instructor. Below that, another line. Founder, USMC Scout Sniper School. Jake's face went pale. Every Marine shooter knew that name. Morrison was a legend, mentioned in the same breath as Carlos Hathcock and Chuck Moini. He'd literally written the book on long-range precision shooting, a manual still used today. The Wikipedia page Jake was frantically pulling up on his phone confirmed it. 87 confirmed kills in Korea, unofficial advisor in Vietnam with even more, trainer of hundreds of snipers who'd gone on to become legends themselves. The tremor, Frank explained with a slight smile, is real. Parkinson's, early stage, but I've learned to work around it. You time your shots between the shakes. It's all about patience and trigger control. 2 things I tried to teach for 40 years. Mike stood at attention instinctively. Gunny Morrison, we had no idea. I'm so sorry for— At ease, son, Frank said gently. You were doing your job, protecting your range and your customers. Nothing wrong with that. He turned to Jake, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. And you were right to be concerned about safety. A shaking old man with a gun is usually a recipe for disaster. But you're not just any old man, Sarah said, having abandoned her post to join the growing crowd. Word had spread through the range like wildfire, and now dozens of shooters were gathering, many recording with their phones. Frank shrugged. These days, I am. Just turned 84 last month. My grandkids think I spend my days watching Price is Right and complaining about my joints. He picked up the Glock again, checking it was clear. I came here because my doctor said I needed to exercise my hand-eye coordination. Figured this was better than crossword puzzles. Gunny, one of the other shooters, a young Marine on leave, stepped forward. Could you show us something? I mean, if you're willing. It would be an honor. Frank looked around at the eager faces. Well, I suppose one demonstration wouldn't hurt. Mike, what's the longest range you have here? 1,000 yards, Mike replied immediately. But Gunny, with your condition— The tremor, Frank smiled. Son, in Korea, I made a 1,200-yard shot during an artillery barrage. My spotter thought I was having a seizure from the concussions. Still dropped the Chinese colonel who was directing mortar fire on our position. He moved toward the long-range section. Let's see what these modern rifles can do. Jake scrambled to fetch the range's prize possession, a Custom Accuracy International AXMC in .338 Lapua, worth more than most cars. This is our most precise rifle, Gunny. Sub-MOA guaranteed, equipped with Schmidt and Bender scope, Frank finished, examining the rifle with expert hands that no longer shook. 5 to 25 power, 56mm objective lens. Nice glass. We had to make do with untold 10 powers in my day. Sometimes just iron sights. He shouldered the rifle, and suddenly the frail old man was gone. In his place stood a warrior, even if an aged one. The crowd moved to the observation area for the long range. Frank took his position, settling behind the rifle with a fluidity that spoke of countless hours of practice. Jake started to offer advice about the wind conditions, but Mike stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. Frank studied the wind flags for a long moment, made minute adjustments to the scope, and settled in. His breathing slowed until it was barely perceptible. The tremor in his hands returned, but he seemed to incorporate it into his rhythm, finding the stillness between the shakes. The first shot rang out. A second later, the steel target at 1,000 yards sang its metallic confirmation. Frank worked the bolt without lifting his eye from the scope and fired again. Another hit, then another. 5 shots, 5 hits in under 20 seconds. That's impossible at his age, Jake whispered. The calculations alone, compensating for wind, elevation, temperature. It's not calculation, Mike said quietly, understanding dawning on his face. It's instinct. Muscle memory so deep it's part of his DNA. Frank stood up, safetied the rifle, and handed it back to Jake. She shoots true. You've maintained her well. He looked at the young instructor with kind eyes. You know, you remind me of myself when I was your age. So certain that new always means better, that youth equals superiority. Jake couldn't meet his eyes. Gunny, I'm so sorry. The things I said were partially true, Frank interrupted. I am old. My reflexes aren't what they were. My eyes need these ridiculous glasses. And yes, my hands shake. He held up his trembling hand as evidence. But experience counts for something. Knowing not just how to shoot, but when to shoot, and more importantly, when not to. Would you consider teaching here? Mike asked suddenly. Even just once a month. A master class or something. I'd waive all fees, of course, and... Frank chuckled. I'm flattered, but no. My teaching days are behind me. I've got grandkids to spoil and a vegetable garden that needs tending. He started walking toward the exit, then paused. But Jake here seems passionate about instruction. With some humility and proper mentoring, he could be excellent. Jake's face reddened. Gunny, after how I treated you, why would you... Because that's what teachers do, Frank said simply. We pass on knowledge, even to those who initially resist it. Especially to them, actually. As Frank reached the door, Mike called out, Gunnery Morrison! The old Marine turned. Mike and Jake stood at attention and snapped perfect salutes. Slowly, every veteran in the range followed suit. Then even the civilians stood straighter, showing respect in their own way. Frank returned the salute crisply, his eyes glistening slightly. Semper Fi, Marines. Then, quieter. All of you remember. It's not about the weapon or the gear or the latest tactical trends. It's about the fundamentals, breath control, trigger squeeze, and most importantly, the discipline to know that every bullet you send downrange has a consequence. As the door closed behind him, Jake stood frozen, still processing what had happened. Sarah pulled up the full Wikipedia article on her phone, reading aloud, Frank Morrison, credited with revolutionizing Marine Corps sniper training. His manual, One Shot, One Purpose, remains required reading at Scout Sniper School. recipient of the Navy Cross, 3 Silver Stars, and 6 Purple Hearts. 6 Purple Hearts, Mike repeated softly. Man was shot 6 times and kept going back. Jake walked over to the target Frank had shot with the Glock. Those 5 perfect shots through one hole. He carefully removed it from the carrier. "I'm keeping this," he said, "and hanging it where I can see it every day." That afternoon, Jake completely rewrote his training curriculum. The first line now read, "Never judge a shooter by appearance or age. Respect is earned, but it should be offered freely until proven otherwise." Mike instituted a new policy. Veterans over 65 shot for free on Wednesdays. He called it Wisdom Wednesdays, hoping Frank might return. Frank did come back, exactly once more, 3 months later. This time, Jake was waiting. "Gunny Morrison," he said, offering a proper rifle. "I've been practicing that breathing technique you mentioned. Would you mind checking my form?" Frank smiled, the tremor in his hands barely noticeable that day. "Show me what you've got, son." For the next hour, the legend taught the instructor, and Jake absorbed every word like gospel. Other shooters gathered to watch, camera phones away out of respect, understanding they were witnessing something special, the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. When Frank left that final time, he shook Jake's hand firmly. "You'll do fine, Marine." Jake blinked in surprise. "I'm not a Marine, Gunny." "Never served." "You are now," Frank said with a wink. "Once you've been taught by a Marine, you carry a piece of the Corps with you. Use it well." 6 months later, when Frank Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep, the funeral was standing room only. Jake Thompson was there, along with Mike and 50 other shooters from Thunder Ridge. Jake had become known as the best instructor in the state, famous for his patience with elderly shooters and his insistence that wisdom trumps gear every time. At the service, Frank's son revealed that his father had mentioned the range incident in his final weeks. He said it was one of his proudest teaching moments, not because he showed off his skills, but because he found one last student who needed to learn the most important lesson: humility. Jake still has that target, 5 shots, 1 hole, framed in his office. Below it, a small plaque reads, "The day I learned to see clearly. Thank you, Gunny Morrison." And every Wednesday, when the older veterans come to shoot for free, Jake tells them the story of the day a legend walked into Thunder Ridge, pretending to be just another shaky old man, and taught them all what real marksmanship looks like.